Jamie Bartlett, thank you for taking the time to talk to me today. I have a number of questions that we're going to talk about, particularly focused on your book on technology and democracy. But before we get to that, can you just start by telling the people who are watching this what your background is? How did you get this focus on technology and democracy?
Yeah, funnily enough, I started off really looking at extremist and terrorist groups. That was my initial area of interest. I mean, I studied history at university, so there's no obvious natural connection there, but I was recruited to this think tank, Demos, based here in London in the UK, and was very interested in the way extremist groups were operating. This was not too long after the 7/7 attacks in London, and I was living in London at the time. In fact, I was on the Underground in London as those attacks took place, not on the carriages, but I was one of those people that was evacuated. I was evacuated out of the tube, didn't know what was going on. So I always was very interested in that. And one of the things that struck me very early on looking at these groups is how good they were at using technology. They seemed to always be ahead of the curve. They were early adopters. They were very innovative. They seemed to be almost sort of I wouldn't really say sort of creative or innovative in the tech itself, because they weren't developers, but they were definitely early adopters. And I felt like mainstream society could learn something from these radical groups as to how technology would evolve and how you might be able to use it. And so I started almost accidentally getting more and more interested in technology. I then started following the English Defence League here in the UK very closely. This is an anti-Islam group, and saw that they were really the first political movement in the UK that fully understood how to use Facebook as a way of creating a kind of grassroots movement. And a lot of people misunderstood the English Defence League in 2009 when they first arrived, thinking that they were a street-based movement that did protests with a small online contingent. But the reality was the complete opposite. It was fundamentally a big Facebook group that had a very small militant offline wing. And I got very excited as to the prospects of understanding and researching and studying the English Defence League by looking at Facebook, by the Facebook activity and the data that was there, and you could target these people to survey them on Facebook. And there are all these ways of understanding the group that I didn't think academics or researchers were really looking at. And in a weird way, that's what kind of got me into researching the internet. That led me to the Darknet. I wrote a book about the Darknet where I went kind of immersive inside strange internet subcultures for a year and looked at how cryptocurrencies worked and neo-Nazi forums, eating disorder forums, Darknet drugs markets, the mechanics of them. And that, I suppose, then took me on almost naturally into wider questions of how the internet was affecting society and politics, which then took me on to the more recent book about how the internet and democracy sort of in tension with each other.
And that's really what my next question is you talk about there being a battle between information technology and democracy, and you're kind of leading into that, I guess, by talking about the English Defence League and the Darknet. But what can you explain that argument about the battle between technology and democracy?
Yeah, I guess at the moment we're all really quite down on digital technology. There seems to be a mood that the internet's killing democracy, and we have Russian interference, Cambridge Analytica, internet trolling and misogyny, and everyone. We've certainly moved a long way from 2011, which I think was the high watermark of optimism about how the internet was inherently empowering. It was good for democracy. It was good for free speech. It was good for free association. And we've flipped 180 degrees on this. But I don't see it as one side or the other being at fault. I see more an incompatibility problem. And that's where many of these problems stem from. So if you imagine that modern liberal representative democracy, which is really only 100 years old if you include mass suffrage as part of that and mass political parties as part of that, it hasn't really changed very much. And it was all designed around a certain set of formal institutions like a healthy media, informal institutions like a willingness to engage in sort of reasoned political debate, and a kind of, I guess, a set of supporting institutions that made the whole thing kind of work. And the way I see it is that the internet doesn't really follow those rules or that logic. It's a kind of, it doesn't follow the same norms of those institutions, and as a result, it just seems like there's a sort of incompatibility problem between our modern liberal representative democracies in advanced economies and digital technology. And part of that is just the speed with which everything has changed, not allowing our institutions to catch up. And I think that really is the story of Cambridge Analytica and interference or micro-targeted adverts and people thinking the other side's cheating all the time. That is partly a result of the rules and regulations not keeping up with how communications technology now works.
Well, as you say, people seem to be much more concerned today about the impact that technology is having on democracy than they were a few years ago. But the thing you bring to this, I think, is that you are able to create a framework for understanding how technology is impacting democracy. And what I'd like to explore that framework a bit further. But first of all, could you summarize this framework, which you call, I think, the 6 pillars of democracy? What are those? And, can you give us an overview before we explore each one?
Yes, I certainly can. I should probably just grab a copy of the book, actually. So I've got it right here by me. There's one, I can see one. I'm just going to grab it.
Okay.
I am, as you might have guessed, in my front room here. Like many of us, I work from home these days. So yeah, what I was trying to do, I suppose, was to just in the last question I said there's all these institutions that sort of, they're the boring things that make democracy actually work, and we don't always think about them. We think a lot about free speech, and we say, well, the internet's great because it allows us to democratize the media and it allows citizens to have their say more easily. They can organize collectively. And I think that's at least true to some extent. But the focus on those aspects of democracy, I think, has maybe taken our eyes off the boring institutions that also make democracies work. So I came up with 6. I mean, it's not like I was basing this in an accepted literature of what these institutions are, because I was reading people like Francis Fukuyama and others, and there isn't one really. So I just took some that I thought were relatively important. And the first was sort of active citizens who feel like they are capable of making informed, reasoned decisions. And I felt that is possibly under threat from our increasing reliance on machines to make decisions, including moral decisions, for us. A culture of sort of compromise, a willingness and an acceptance that you have to compromise with your political opponents, that to have political disagreements with them does not mean they are evil and nasty or Machiavellian or stupid. It means that you can have principled differences of opinion, but that's what politics is all about. The third was free and fair elections that people can trust in and believe in and have confidence in the integrity of, which of course is about Cambridge Analytica, but not just Cambridge Analytica. Cambridge Analytica is the very beginning of how elections are changing. It is not the end point, it's the starting point of a completely different way of doing elections. The fourth, to me, was a strong, relatively stable middle class that pays taxes and joins political parties and reads newspapers, which I think is increasingly under threat. The fifth was a strong and well-resourced independent civil society that's not reliant on technology. So this is, for example, the way that a lot of our means of organizing civil society groups now is through platforms like Facebook. So we don't even know the extent to which that really is free association, because somebody else is kind of controlling how we can collectively organize. And then finally, this is a boring one and a lot of people will disagree with it, but a sovereign authority that can actually work. I mean, a criminal justice system that actually works, a policing system that can function. And this is very important when the police are really struggling to get on top of crime online. You know, we have, it goes back to one of my earlier points. We have crime that's now borderless, but we still have police forces that are organized around geographical constabularies in the UK. It means they don't really work very well. That means people, I think the risk is, will lose faith in the police. And what do you have in response? You have vigilante paedophile gangs who go around trying to hunt for people they consider to be guilty without a fair trial. And I mean, this is one of those boring things that no one thinks about when they think about democracy. You do need a police force that actually works. And I guess I put all of those together and said all of them in small, subtle ways are being gradually eroded. And the danger is not that we suddenly become some kind of weird digital dictatorship, but we gradually lose trust in democracy because we say it doesn't seem to work very well for us anymore.
I think it's a really useful framework, and not just to understand it, but presumably to help people to develop solutions to maintain democracy and improve it in the future.
Well, that's what I'm hoping your students. That's what I'm hoping your students are going to figure out. You know.
So am I. I mean, the statistics, just as an aside, seem to suggest that young people are less concerned about democracy than people who are older today. And this is, you know, something I discuss with my students, but maybe an area of concern that shows that what's happening today is having an impact. But the next question I had was around, and just to look a little bit more at each of these pillars. The first one was around free will. How do you think technology is impacting free will? And how is this impacted by what you call, and others call, technological singularity?
Yeah. Well, I call it, so technological singularity is a good place to start, because that's the idea that Ray Kurzweil and some of these other sort of radical futurists say is the moment that is around 2045, according to them, when machines become so much smarter that they're capable of making smarter versions of themselves, at which point there'll be this kind of runaway process, leaving humans basically, I wouldn't say completely useless, but certainly far less significant as a sort of means of moral authority, because machines will be able to make better decisions than us in almost every domain possible. And a lot of that often focuses on work, or the idea that machines will be able to do every task that humans can currently do far cheaper and far better than we can. There'll be millions of unemployed and so on. But I looked at it in a slightly different way, and I tried to coin the phrase moral singularity, which is when we begin to rely on machines, smart machines, to take moral decisions on our behalf instead. So we sort of lean on machines more and more for decisions which citizens should be taking for themselves. And an example I give is, a very simple one. We have millions of people this Christmas just gone have bought smart household assistants. Alexa and Siri, you know, especially I think Alexa's the one, Google Home's not. Another one, but I think Alexa's the biggest, where you can, for example, say, would you tell me what the news is today? So that's a really quite important decision for a citizen to take. I mean, you have to be a bit careful about what news sources you use, which ones you rely on, which ones you trust. it's not something that you would just outsource to a machine because it's easy, but I think more and more people are doing it. And to me, it's a very small step from that to, Alexa, who should I vote for this election? Now, millions of people, we may laugh at that, but millions of people already rely on voter apps to advise them how to vote. You tap in a few of your opinions on a survey that you undertake on an app, and then it recommends which party you should vote for. I mean, to me, this is ridiculous. This is the one duty of a citizen, is to read up on the political parties and think for yourself about it. And I see this happening in lots of different ways. I see it in when jobs employers decide to outsource their thinking to CV checking machines. You see more and more judges relying on artificial intelligence to help with sentencing guidelines or parole decisions. And I fear that gradually what is eroded there is individuals' sense of moral autonomy, the ability to think for yourself about complex moral decisions. And I obviously talk about this in a lot of different ways. Another one is how increasingly I think it can be quite difficult on social media to be a sort of informed citizen, because it's very easy to go along with the crowd and be swayed by your peers in what they're screaming and shouting about online, and everything's about the good guys versus the bad guys with very little nuance in the middle. And I think that's quite difficult for especially a young person to form nuanced political positions when everything's just a screaming and shouting match. And I suppose it's like, I want to stress that this is not something I think that I worry about will happen overnight, but it's a sort of 20 or 30 year long change, which in the grand scheme of things is not very long. And I fear we become less capable as, I suppose, autonomous moral actors.
So technology's thinking for us rather than us doing the thinking ourselves, which...
Yeah, and the danger is as well. I mean, Peter, maybe the machines can think better than us about these questions. We're not always that good at making moral judgments.
Absolutely, but that is part of humanity, I guess, and
Well, exactly.
The world would be different if we didn't make bad decisions.
Yeah, exactly. So we might end up with this kind of weird benevolent dictatorship, which makes better decisions, is more efficient and more effective. We don't even understand how it thinks.
Yeah.
Now, you could call that a better, so you might even think that's a better society, even a more humane society, but I don't know whether you'd call it a democratic society.
Wouldn't be much fun.
Well, I don't think it'd be very much fun, but, some people, history has shown that some people might prefer it if it could guarantee jobs better,
Yeah.
if it could mean we get nicer gadgets that are better at fulfilling various needs. People might prefer it.
Absolutely. Okay, then the next of the pillars was around tribalism and populist politics. Can you talk a bit about that, about how tribalism and populism are enabled by information technology and impacting democracy?
Yeah, and this is something as well. I mean, I spent a lot of time with radical movements in the course of my research work. I've sort of gone undercover with them, or I've done sort of deep ethnographic research work with them. So this is not just a sort of theoretical argument. I feel like I know this quite closely firsthand. And I think a good place to start here is the optimism of the 1990s, which was that once everyone was connected and we had more information at our fingertips, politics would become sort of wiser, calmer, more rational, more thoughtful, more about detailed arguments. It would appeal more to the head than the heart because we'd have access to all these ideas. And so the aspiration was that we would become, I suppose we'd get along better, and we'd become enlightened, and our politics would be kinder. But it feels like almost the opposite has happened, and I think it's based on a fundamental misunderstanding about how humans make decisions. I mean, the truth is, and I think the defining feature of social media is being overwhelmed with information, a kind of constant battering of conflicting information coming at you 24 hours a day. And it's very hard to process this level of information. I don't know how you feel, but when I go online for half an hour, I come off, I feel more confused than before I went on. I feel like I don't even understand the situation. And I come off slightly more angry, more bitter, more frustrated. I see, and it's not that I don't see opposing opinions to my own. I see them all the time. I get even maybe more entrenched in my own worldview when I see opposing views. And the reason is simple. It's that we're not really designed to deal with this level of information. We're not machines. We can't process that amount of information. And so I think increasingly we have to rely on emotions, on feelings, on heuristics, all the cognitive biases that we always suffer from, simply to be able to process the amount of information we're confronted with. And I think that is why we increasingly see people becoming more entrenched in their position, more convinced about their right and the other side are evil and stupid and wrong. And I see this on the left as much as I see it on the right. And it's creating a politics which I think makes compromise more difficult, which, as you can see in the current US shutdown and the current debate in the UK over Brexit, is quite unhealthy because nothing happens and everyone gets more and more frustrated and angry and gets more and more extreme. And politics isn't about that. It is about trying to find compromises with opposing views. And it's harder if you are constantly surrounded by the same people telling you that you're right and the other side are wrong.
So you're saying that all the information that people are bombarded with, that they have available through the internet, is causing them to go into bubbles, to build walls where they're safe from this bombardment to a degree, and more likely to adopt an extreme position.
Yeah, I think so. And it's not that you completely block yourself off from opposing views. This is the kind of filter bubble argument. I think it's that you do see those opposing views, but because of the nature of communication online, which is very short and rapid and quick, it's never enough to cause you to really listen or think about those opposing views. You will often dismiss it or disregard it. Or one of the things I see quite common is forming a caricature of your opponent's position. Yeah. So some people call this nut picking. You pick the craziest, most extreme version of your opponent's position and then take that to be normal and then define yourself against that. Yeah. And so it's not that you're completely walled off from political differences. It's just that the nature of communication makes it a bit more difficult for you to be able to engage with it in a meaningful sense. And I think that's one of those examples where our institutions haven't really been designed or have not caught up yet with this new information environment, because we haven't really learned how to deal with this new operating system, if you like.
Okay, and to move on to the next pillar, the electoral process, how is all of this impacting the process and the outcome of elections?
Well, I think this is quite a simple one, really. Even though it's had an awful lot of coverage recently, the story of Cambridge Analytica, in my mind, it has been slightly misreported. It's not about some magical psychological tool that has tricked millions of people into voting for one side or the other. It's more the way that elections, because Cambridge Analytica are doing things that a lot of other political parties are doing all the time. It's kind of industry standard what they're doing. It is the increasing segmentation of audiences into smaller and smaller categories of people, driven by marketing, like the commercial sector, which is ultimately going to lead to categories of one, you and you alone will be targeted with an advert that's only for your eyes, based on a ever more sophisticated and detailed profile of your hopes, concerns and aspirations. This to me is quite a negative development in elections generally, because what it means is elections are no longer about making broad-based arguments that everybody else gets to see, everybody else gets to discuss. It's about targeting individuals with a message that appeals to them, that nobody else gets to see. The regulators don't get to see it either. And this is not good for elections. It's very hard to hold a politician to account if a politician has made 1 million promises to 1 million different people, which is what is going to happen in the next 10 years. And within a decade, your smart fridge and your smart TV and your smart baby monitor and your smart clothes and your smart pen and paper, all connected to the internet, will be collecting data and will be targeting adverts at you based on profiles that have been built up that you don't even understand. And this is one of the things that this does, I think, is it allows whoever loses an election to say that the other side has cheated and therefore the result is illegitimate, because the regulators can't see what's going on, so everybody says that everybody else is cheating. And I think that's not about whether, it's not even about whether these techniques work or not. It's about whether people trust the election to be an honest reflection of how people voted and how people feel. And I think that's the thing that we, your students especially, should be worrying about, which is how do we change the rules so that in 20 years' time, when everything is connected up and everyone gets an advert at them and them alone, how do we run an election in those circumstances? Because my first election was Tony Blair's landslide election in 1997, which is, over 20 years ago now. And if someone had have told me how the elections would be run now, I wouldn't have believed them. Go ahead. Please. No, I was going to say, so let's imagine in another 20 years what we'll be doing, and are we ready for it?
Yeah, I mean, my first election was before Tony Blair's, and but I was involved at that time in targeting before we had the internet, and to imagine now what could be done targeting wise, as you say, ultimately to target individuals, that target of one is, from a political point of view, an incredible thing, something very hard to imagine. But then to look forward as to what this might be like in the future. I mean, I don't have the answer either, but it does seem to be something that attention is required for. But to go further, the next point you made was around inequality and how technology is widening the gap, perhaps, between rich and poor, between good jobs and bad jobs and no jobs. And you've got views on this and its impact on democracy. And you've also got views on the universal basic income that I'm keen that you share.
Yeah, I suppose it's a lot of the concern at the moment with artificial intelligence. And I run a machine learning research center, so I'm sort of familiar with the technologies involved, is that it's going to lead to mass unemployment. And I don't think that's true, because we can't really imagine what sorts of jobs will be. We can imagine the jobs that won't be necessary in a decade's time because we know what they are. But we can't imagine the jobs that we haven't yet invented. So we're almost hardwired to be pessimistic about this. I'm sure we'll come up with wonderful, exciting new jobs. The question is, will the people who lose out be able to get these wonderful new jobs we create? So will the people who are truck drivers or call center operators, they're two of the job categories that many analysts think will be under severe threat in a decade's time, will they be able to get these wonderful, snazzy, exciting jobs in tech startups in 20 years' time? And I fear they won't. This is... Am I detecting a slight Scottish accent in your voice here?
Yeah, it's there. Yeah. My heritage is Scottish. Yeah.
Right. Oh, my granddad's from Glasgow, but so your compatriot. It feels like your old compatriot, Gordon Brown. His kind of approach to this was, we're entering into this wonderful new world of technological change. It's all about skilling up workers, making sure they can become the high-end workers of the future, and it just never seems to happen. People always end up being left behind. The transition's too fast. You can't expect a 50-year-old trucker who's been doing that forever, who's left school at 16, to suddenly become a robotics engineer or something. It's just unrealistic. And what I worry about is that's the far more likely outcome of rapid AI-driven change is that we get loads of really cool jobs, a load of really rubbish jobs, service sector jobs, and not really that much in between. And so inequality begins to widen. The poor, the sort of people who are left behind, get more and more frustrated. The people who are getting these wonderful jobs are more and more disparaging of those who haven't made the leap up. And society just gets more and more fractured. And this is why I'm skeptical about universal basic income as a solution, because I'm not sure whether it solves that problem of inequality. It might mean that people have things to do all day and they can write poetry and fish and swim and have a great time with their... But who wants to be reliant on that? Who wants to live in a society where there's a few very, very rich people at the top, who, by the way, seem to be... excuse me, my computer's making some noises. A few very rich people at the top who seem to be sort of determined to pay as little tax as possible, and everybody else who's receiving handouts. I can't. Maybe I have a lack of imagination, but I cannot see how that would be a sustainable system.
Yeah, I've heard it expressed as, that the universal basic income allows the people at the top to get off the hook, but really doesn't do a lot for the people at the bottom.
Well, I've interviewed a lot of people about this, because I did a BBC series over in Silicon Valley about some of these things, and I've often asked these people, the very rich people who currently in Silicon Valley is currently a very in vogue idea. Would you be happy receiving a state mandated universal basic income?
No.
They wouldn't. Of course they wouldn't. They don't mind everybody else getting it, but they wouldn't want it themselves. I think it's an interesting idea, because any idea that can excite both the libertarian right and the communist left, because it's popular within the sort of radical left as well, is something that's worth considering, thinking about, talking about. I like the creativity of it. We should think about bold ideas. I'm just not convinced it's quite right. Some people have suggested a universal training income, that you have a right to be paid by the state to retrain if your work becomes unnecessary due to machines. And I would be maybe more inclined to think that's something that's worth pursuing.
Yeah, absolutely. You talked about Silicon Valley. The tech companies are now becoming more and more powerful. Looks like they might continue to grow. Should we be concerned about that? And what do you think should be done about it?
We should definitely be concerned about it. You already see that the big tech companies are the largest lobbyists in many countries. I think they have, unlike other forms of and this is my fifth pillar, I suppose, that unlike other forms of lobbying, that they also mediate the way we engage in politics. And I tell the story, quite a famous story, that where Google had decided to come out against a proposed piece of legislation in 2012 about piracy, and all it needed to do was add a little thing onto the Google homepage, say, email your congressperson about stopping this piece of legislation. And the bill was it collapsed almost overnight, because the power of a single company to be able to control the political debate, it's unprecedented. So there's certainly a reason to be nervous and to be worried. And again, as hard as it is to believe, I think the trends would suggest that the monopolies we have at the moment, and the 5 biggest companies in the world by capital value are West Coast technology firms, are going to get even bigger, those monopolies, because I see the tendencies towards concentration of power when it comes to the Internet of Things and artificial intelligence to kind of follow the same pattern as digital technology. Network effects means the biggest ones get better all the time, and they can crush competitors, they can buy them out. So what do we do? Well, that's a much harder question. And you'll note that the book is more about diagnosing problems and coming up with really good solutions. But clearly the regulators are going to have a far more aggressive anti-competitive regulatory system. So takeovers and mergers in particular, they're going to have to look at, far more closely. One good example is people can't seem to define the modern digital monopoly very well because it doesn't fall into the existing categories. Because we've always had a problem with monopolies when they have damaged consumer welfare. So when they jack up the prices, but a lot of these services are free and it's all about advertising. And so it's hard to work out where the consumer harm is. But if you see Google and Facebook as advertising companies rather than media companies, you can see there's a consumer welfare harm because advertisers are having to deal with a duopoly. And I think they are losing out. They're not getting as good a deal as they might as a result, because they are the ones that are actually paying for those services. It's not us, the users, it's the advertisers. So we may need to redefine what the monopoly is if we're going to be able to control it.
Well, I hope it's something that, policy develops appropriately for. The value, of course, of what you've done is to be contributing to that debate, to be highlighting it, to be emphasizing that it's important. And, that's a step in the right direction, hopefully. Your final pillar was around crypto anarchy, which was a part of your book I particularly enjoyed, and the whole story of crypto anarchy that's there. But I was also interested that I think you also say that Bitcoin is a manifestation of crypto anarchy, and helps you to illustrate the impact that crypto anarchy might have. So I'm sure very few people who are watching this understand what crypto anarchy is. I do, because I've read that part of your book. Maybe you could say a little bit about what it is and how it might influence how we think about privacy. Because I think it really puts another nuance on our understanding and our approach to privacy.
Yeah, the interesting thing about crypto anarchy, which I will define, is that in some senses it's an answer to some of the problems of the last question. Mm-hmm. Like the need to take control of your data, to use encryption, to be mindful of your internet privacy is definitely one bit of the way that we overcome some of these problems. But at the extreme end, total, how do I describe it? Like widespread, unbreakable encryption being used by citizens all the time for everything actually poses a real threat to the state, because the state needs to be able to control information, control the money supply, break encryption at some points. And so to me, the stuff about crypto anarchy is interesting in that some of it's good and too much of it's bad. So what is crypto anarchy? Well, an interesting set of people in the early 1990s from the West Coast again, from San Francisco, saw all this wonderful, exciting new digital technology, but rather than being hugely optimistic about it, realized that it might lead to unprecedented levels of state surveillance. It might lead to corporations being able to monitor our every mood and trade on our attention, and realized that every internet user needed access to powerful encryption to be able to stay protected against this, because they feared a kind of new age of mass surveillance. And their hope was they could build powerful encryption, i.e. digital tools to be able to keep things private and only revealed to people you wanted them revealed to. They hoped that they could put that in the hands of ordinary internet users, but they went beyond that because they thought that that was the key to. A lot of them were hardline libertarians, right-wing libertarian, Ayn Rand followers, who hoped that through that they could bring down governments. They could take down many of them were explicitly anti-democratic. They would say democracy is no friend of liberty. All it does is enforce the will of the stupid majority on everybody else. And we don't like it. And We don't like centralized governments. We think taxation is theft, all the usual libertarian things. And the way to get around this is everyone has powerful encryption, including, especially, control over the money supply. Because that is how governments tax you. That's how they monitor you. Without taxing you, there is no government. So that was the part of the impetus behind Bitcoin when it was first founded, was from this movement to stop central banks having control over the money supply. Bitcoin was created to be a kind of decentralized, very difficult to monitor digital cash that allowed peer-to-peer transactions beyond the surveillance of the state. And it's a really exciting philosophy. I mean, it's one of the most interesting new political philosophies of the last 50 years, frankly. But like I say, a lot of people have embraced it thinking it's wonderful and exciting without realizing the longer term implications of this are actually potentially undemocratic. Because if everyone has all of this, you might be able to pass a law about changing tax. You might be able to pass a law that forces, create, or a judge can issue a warrant to monitor someone's communications, and you can't do it. It's impossible because the encryption won't allow you to. And so I have a very, I'm sort of ambivalent really about crypto anarchy, because I think on one side it's a very exciting, useful philosophy, but on another there is a risk that we take it too far, and it's if you like, it's a threat to the state from the other side. Everything we've spoken about so far is about the concentration of power and wealth in the hands of a tiny number of people, and it's all about data and control and network effects, monopolies. This is what happens if we go too far the other way.
Yeah, and that is absent from the debate mostly at the moment, where there's a concern about privacy. People are scared about what's happening to their data, rightly so in many ways. But what you're saying is that it can go the other way too far too. We can have too much privacy, and that seems to be very, very important that we have that as part of the discussion.
Yeah, I mean, and look at the way, I don't know if you've been following it, but the recent ICOs, initial coin offerings, which are ways that brand new normally cryptocurrencies or blockchain-based companies raise money through issuing tokens that people can buy, which they can then later exchange for this new currency. None of it's backed by any central bank, not really regulated yet. And a lot of people have lost a lot of money because of this, and the government can't get the money back for them. There's no regulation to help them, and that's what your government's there for, to protect you and to make sure if you're ripped off, you have recourse. And these people don't have recourse. I think that's going to change in the next couple of years. I think we'll have a lot of regulation. It's one of the things I recommend, that we need more regulation of this area. Yeah.
Makes total sense. So I got two further questions. Having gone through all your pillars, the natural next question, and I think it's where you go in your book too, is what should we do to save democracy? What are some of the things we should do to deal with all these problems?
Well, all the book, like 5/6 of the book is all about problems, and then 1/6 is dedicated to solutions. So it's a bit unbalanced. As you can maybe see, it's just like how we save it is in parentheses at the end. So I came up with 20 ideas, 20 things people could do. They're not very well formed in terms of, they're a paragraph each. It's not really up to the challenge. And again, it's something that I hope people will think about. I mean, to give you one very simple thing, all of us are somehow complicit in this problem, because all of us have preferred the convenience of easy digital services where we've given away our data, given away our privacy, given away our attention in exchange for something free or convenient. And I think we're beginning to realize that has consequences. And so one thing I hope, at a very, very basic level, people become more politicized in the things they actually do online. In the same way that we now worry about, we must buy fair trade coffee and we must buy free range eggs because that's the right thing to do. It helps encourage the market as well. And many of us now think that's a sort of moral obligation on us. I would suggest it's the same thing when it comes to what you click on. what services you use, what search engine do you use, how much data do you share. And I'm not going to be prescriptive in what exactly people should do. It's up to them. But at least be aware that there's a political consequences for those actions, and that every click you make is feeding the mega machine that is making these systems better, smarter, wiser, more compelling. And so understand your complicity in this and then make your choices.
Absolutely, and that's a message that I hope people will get from the course that this video is part of, and perhaps others too who might watch it. So I got one more question,
Okay.
which is that the people who are watching this, most of them are engineering and computer science students at the University of Waterloo, so they'll be starting careers in technology soon. And I just wanted to ask you if you've got any advice that you would like to give them about that might be useful in their lives in some way. Anything that you want to give them.
Oh, wow. I wasn't expecting that question.
It's a really hard one because
It is, isn't it?
Because it's a big responsibility.
Yeah, I guess there's a great weight of responsibility here on engineers now. People who write algorithms, who build these systems, who may not always really understand that increasingly the decisions that they make, that most of us don't really understand, have real implications for ordinary people's everyday lives. So being conscious and aware of that, I guess, firstly makes you realize quite how important that task is. The appreciation that your design choices aren't necessarily driven only by the mathematics or the engineering problem you're facing, but you might wish to consider the political, social ramifications of those decisions you're making. And to do that, I guess, requires you to read far more widely, to read books of philosophy and politics, because many of the people on your course, even without realizing it, will make a lot of political choices simply by their engineering decisions. And I have a great deal of confidence in the next generation of people, because I think they've grown up thinking about these things a lot more now. And I hear more and more young university students, as worried as I am about all of these things, they're very conscious of this. So I believe that they will be the generation that will make much better choices. To do that, I think, will require reading far more widely than the course literature. And I don't even mean this book, right? I don't even mean, because this isn't wide. This is still, read books of, the works of ancient philosophers, things that aren't to do with technology at all, but about morality and ethics and philosophy. And I think that the people that can combine those disciplines, they're the people I'm hopeful, they're the people I'm relying on to solve this problem.
Well, I don't think it'll do them any harm to read your book either, but but of course reading more widely too will be good as well. I'm really grateful for you talking to me today, Jamie. We've covered all the things I wanted to cover, and I think this is going to be really valuable for the students. So, thanks for doing it.
No, pleasure. Thanks very much for inviting me on, and good luck to all the students. And if anyone, you included, of course, Peter, have any further questions or comments or thoughts, just send them my way. Email me, Twitter at me if you must. And because I'd love to hear what you think.
Wonderful. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thanks.